is fairly straightforward. Good, thank you, whoever that was. The background to this was Ian actually suggested to us in the autumn last year that we should talk to a number of chief executives and others in housing associations, and we did that. And the first thing that came out of that was a number of insights, because we asked these chief executives and the like to tell us, what are they expecting in terms of the measurement of their relationship with their tenants, and what are they actually getting? Those two questions. And it was interesting. So what did the leaders want and what do they get? And the first thing they said they wanted was independent, objective, unbiased insight. And the second thing was that insight should provide them with a prioritized list of areas for improvement. What can we do to improve the relationship with our tenants, our customers? And that insight needs to be based on what matters to them, so they can provide a better customer experience. And one of the interesting things that came out of it was that they recognized that advocacy of their organization by tenants is an outcome of meeting their expectations, and it is not about being satisfied. And in the Q&A, I'm very happy to go into that in a lot more detail. But to show you what we did, here's a little run through of actually what happened. The first thing is that we set out to understand the tenant's real expectations of an ideal experience as a tenant from their housing provider. And I'll show you in a minute what that looked like. The second thing was, how well does the housing association perform against these expectations? And from that, we get a performance gap, which we then worked on a short workshop, a couple of hours, to debrief the 5 housing associations that were involved. And they can now build a positive plan for taking that forward and making the improvements that are suggested. When we're thinking about the expectations part of the story, the 5 housing associations which were involved are shown here and listed here. And the question we asked their tenants is, what expectations would you have of an ideal social housing landlord? And you can see in the chart here the number who were polled and the number who responded and what the overall numbers are. One thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the fact that 2 of the housing associations, Platform and Richmond, both used incentives. And you can notice the difference that incentives have produced in terms of the data. What is important about this is that we got 908 verbatims coming out of the 180 respondents. And that's not an unusual number. That's the sort of number we would generally expect from this type of work. These were condensed down to 46 expectations. And from that, we were able to produce what is called an expectations map. This is a one-page picture of the tenant experience, the ideal that they're looking for. And you'll notice here very quickly that there are 3 what we call domains: product quality, cost, and service quality. And it's extremely easy to see that the service quality aspects are by far the more numerous of the expectations. The other thing that we did is to analyze the data using the methods which we do for all of our research work. And some of the expectations came out showing that they were TOM, top of mind, for some of these customers. So in this respect, respond in a timely manner got 598 in its weighting, which is the highest one of the lot. Important this because when we look at the overall map with the 46 expectations, we then reduced it down from this weighting to an actual number of 19. And here they are. These are the 19 expectations that came from that piece of research at the beginning. You can see straight away that 4 of them are top of mind, and they have a weighting score which is considerably more than the rest of them. And this is not unusual. This is completely normal as we would expect it. Having gathered the expectations and having run a small workshop for the 5 housing associations involved to explain what the map looked like and what the expectations data was telling them, we then went into the second stage that Ian and I had agreed in advance. And this is the expectations being used in the performance survey. And so that the expectations were the questions in the survey, and we sent them out again to the same 5 housing associations. And this time they polled a larger number of customers than they did in the first round, and believe actually it polled all of their customers. You can see the response rates. Again, the 2 with incentives actually had the highest number of, or percentage, should I say, of responses. And you can see that we got, again, a total of 429 respondents completing the survey. And in those survey responses, we got 267 open text improvement comments, which are being made. This is useful data, and it gives us a little bit of a clear view on what we need to be doing. We then put those results into our analysis process, and I need to explain a little bit about what we do here, because it's fundamental to understanding what we're looking for. We use something called a zone of tolerance, and the zone of tolerance is what a tenant or a group of tenants would measure for given expectations. Those expectations will drop into a range, and that range is represented by this vertical box here. If it's a long box, then it shows that there are long or deep expectations, and they tolerate a wider range of performance. So the performance scores can be spread over a wide range. If it's a shallow box or short, it indicates that the customers or the tenants expect, they have sort of what they call essential expectations regarding this particular one. In other words, the housing association doesn't have a great deal of wiggle room. They don't have an opportunity for doing too much. This is pretty fundamental. And it basically tenants are saying, you've got to get this one right. So you might turn around and say, well, how do we get this? How do we get this zone of tolerance? Well, the answer is we ask the customers. And the zone is represented in three ways. First of all, the ideal score is the score at the top of the zone. And that's the best or ideal performance for any given expectation. The bottom of the zone is the minimum acceptable score for the worst or the minimum performance that they will accept. So you can see that, those are the brackets of the top and the bottom of the zone. So when we actually score, when we ask them to score a particular housing association, the score is represented by this ball. And the midpoint of that represents where the performance is for any given expectation. So what's this mean? It means that the scoring possibilities are as follows. First of all, within the zone of tolerance, you're doing okay. You're performing within the range. You can get it above the zone, which is you're exceeding even the ideal. Are you actually doing more than you need to? Excuse me. Or beneath, which is beneath the minimum level of performance, and therefore corrective action is required. So this gives you a picture of how the scoring works. The sweet spot where an organization should be in an ideal sense is right there at the top, just inside the zone or just near the top of it. And that's the ideal place to be. Now, what we of course are doing here is scoring an emotional response, but on a fairly factual basis. So the responses, the emotional responses, can be based on a sort of chart like this. So you get right at the top, they're thrilled, and right at the bottom, they find it intolerable. And somewhere in between is a different range of emotional responses. And you'll notice here that the bottom half of the zone of tolerance is what we call the zone of indifference. And this is where if they are in that environment where they could switch to somebody else, and of course, in most cases, they're not. This is where we might say, they're reasonably happy, but not actually over the moon about the relationship that they have and the performance of the housing provider. If any of you are familiar with and are using the Net Promoter Score, that maps onto this in this way. This, of course, is giving significantly more detailed data than NPS does. And of course, it's very much more rigorous in many respects. So how did the housing associations do it? And what I'm now going to show you is the 4 charts of the performance of our 5 housing associations. And it also shows the top of mind scores. So here we go. Here on the bottom are the expectations. And on the 7-point scale that we use, you can see that most of the scores here are towards the bottom end of the zone of tolerance. One of them, this one here, set fair affordable rents, is actually in what we would call the sort of the midpoint area, towards the top, more higher end of it, and therefore they're doing a little bit better. And that's why you get a green number. This one here and these ones are all towards the bottom end. So that's the first of the 4 charts. The next one, very similar sort of pattern, but in this case, nearly all of the scores are towards very much the bottom end of the zone of tolerance. So just within range, just okay, could do better, is the message. A similar pattern here, but we've got one where it's actually outside the bottom of the zone of tolerance. And so that becomes a red score. Maintain regular two-way contact with tenants. And obviously that one is an area where there are considerable scope for improvement required here by the tenants. And our last one also has got a red on, and that's regularly upgrade, modernize, or add properties. And again, that one is clearly beneath the minimum acceptable level. And so the tenants are seeing that there is a requirement for a need for improvement there. So that's, if you like, the summary of the data. What we also do is we present this data in a slightly different format to show you how all of the scores have worked. You can see the top of mind, and you can see the essentials. And there are two which are, we give them greens because they're actually doing reasonably well. And that's because the gap scores are less than 0.99. Anything more than that gets into the amber category. And then when it gets further down there, more than minus 1.5, then we get into the red category. The spread of data here is not particularly surprising. It's the sort of data spread that we would expect. And it's also good to see that at least two of the top of mind expectations are near the top of the chart. But it's also indicating that some of the other two are further down, and there is a need to pay attention to those because they're pretty fundamental, pretty important. Now, in the conversations, if you like, the electronic conversations we had with the tenants, we were also able to extract, as I said earlier, a lot of comments from them. And we have analyzed those comments and put them into groups. And I'm not going to go through all of these slides word by word, but you'll see a high level view of the sort of things that are being said. We've also been able to attribute the comments to a particular housing association. So you can see the sort of things that are being said. I'm sure that some of them will not surprise you, but nonetheless, it's worthy of having to look at it. Under property maintenance and repairs, there was some commentary about updates and modernization required, 40 comments. Improved standards of maintenance and repair, including quality checks, 30 comments. Improvement to communal grounds and surrounding, 28 comments. And then better parking, 6 comments. The important thing here is to realize that the comments that they're giving you are actually, in a way, suggestions for improvement. These are things which, when you analyze them in each case, they can be extremely useful and give you guidance on what you need to focus on. And particularly, not just what you need to focus on, but how you need to focus it. The second theme was about customer service, and there are 2 slides here. Quite a lot of comments. So better or faster follow-up on repairs and commitments. And so you can see the sort of reaction that people are giving. And here's just one example. Every time I've reported a repair, I have to complain before I get anything done. It's a very simple comment. It's the sort of comment which is about service, which we see in many different fields, many different sectors. More regular property inspections or check-ins with tenants, 31 comments. Improve the ease of contact or communications. It's quite interesting how in a conversation with others, we actually recognize now that in some cases, the tenants, our customers, have got more adaptive capability in the pandemic environment than some of the organizations they work with. And then the last one on this page, listen to and be more respectful of tenants. So there's quite a lot of commentary in that field, 35. Second page, provide more information or updates to tenants, 29 comments. Improvements needed to management and administration systems, 16 comments. And then some commentary about policy changes. The last page is about personal safety and security. Dealing with antisocial behavior, of course, is a strong issue, 22 comments. And physical measures to improve safety is another one. So those are, if you like, the sort of comments in general. We had one selection of comments which sort of didn't necessarily fit into a general pattern. So with multiple improvements needed, there were quite negative comments, and some positive ones where the tenant was satisfied and they didn't need any improvement required. So that's the story of the actual work that we did, and I'm going to hand over back now to Ian for taking that further.
Okay, thank you very much, Ron. A great sort of run through there. If you're not familiar with the methodology, you can probably see why we wanted to sort of test that that approach out. At this point, I sort of just like to really thank all of the participants who took part in the lab, mainly because it's never easy to sort of get your sort of washing sort of aired in public like that. And I think this is part of what we try to sort of do with the lab, which is actually, you've got to be brave to participate with it, but also be brave to sort of share the findings. And I think that as a sector, that is a good thing, that we're not frightened of being able to take issues and complaints. And actually, the point is you can do something about them here. I'm going to continue through the floor, and so I've got sort of Helena and Bill, and then we'll sort of take questions, Rowan, at the end, because there's quite a few coming through on the chat. And whatever we don't get answered in this session, I promise we will follow up and we will send those out to everybody. So Helena, could you sort of just come on now and sort of, again, share for everybody's benefit the lab experience and what we found from that?
Yeah, just hopefully just get into the right mode. Can everybody see that? Great.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So only just a really quick run through of the lab itself, and Ian touched on that about the contribution of the actual labbies coming onto it, and just what a difference that makes. So this has been a year of labs for us at DIN. It's a relatively new thing that we've been doing. So to a degree, the labs have been a lab in themselves, and it's fair to say that each lab is different. That's designed around the requirements. Are we testing a technical product? Are we testing a methodology? Are we or are we looking at something different? And the pace and the frequency and the setup of those is all very different. It just depends on that. But one thing I would say that runs like a stick of rock through all of them, and it's come up a number of times already today, is just how collaborative those labs are, and the quality of the peer sharing that we get has been really impressive, and it's been really helpful, and hopefully it's given the participants a richer experience as a result of that, because yeah, it is quite an ask to do these things together. So the guinea pigs, I don't know whether we've said it in it so far, but the guinea pigs in this case that took part, and there's a number of people in the room today, are all here. And I would say, you know, thumbs up to everybody that took part, and particularly the project managers who were absolutely spot on in working with us and each other, and with promising outcomes to make this a very smooth experience. So it was a really, really great collective. What you'll see there as well, we got organisations of different sizes, different geographies as well, which was great and really added to that. The lab experience itself ran over 3 phases, and I think we kicked off around April, though we did some pre-work before then, but and it's obviously coming to a conclusion, this part anyway at the moment. And that's really, there was the preparation and setup phase, and that was principally working with the project leads and also the sponsors, so that we got clarity about what the outcomes were going to be, how we were going to get there, what the rhythm of the lab was, setting all of that up. We also did the kickoff in that phase as well, which is important, particularly to engage with sponsors. And then there was the real meaty part of the lab, which was really the collation of all of the data and working with the project leads, particularly on that. And I have to say, I remember Kathy, Rowan and I having a conversation about how this can sometimes get delayed, and particularly when we've got 5 members in the lab, we thought, you know, this is going to be quite a challenge to keep everybody up to pace. But I have to say it went really, really smoothly, and you know, really want to thank the project leads particularly for working with us to get all of that data collection in really smoothly. And then of course we moved into the results and the analysis and the sharing phase. So over three phases, and it all once we got up and running, it all went relatively smoothly. What was in it for our members? Well, this goes back to the brochure that we promised. So we wanted people to understand a different driver for an approach. So it was the expectations driven feedback approach, opportunity to compare that to their current practice, be part of that peer group and share and learn together, and then also take away what the ideal expectations were for a tenant customer relationship. But you know, accepting that was on an aggregate basis, because there were 5 members, we were working with five sets of data. So that's really what we promised. And looking at the feedback afterwards, I think we we got to all of those points. Always at DIN, it's what went well, but also happy to look at even better if. So our www.ebis, based on the feedback from our members, really focused on opportunity to work and learn from promising outcomes, and sharing the outcomes with the mixed peer group. That came up as one of the most valued things from the experience. And then the format worked, which was good to hear. So we wanted this to be a great experience for our members. So the format certainly went quite smoothly. Even better if you're ever dealing with contractual sharing of data across 5 organisations and with an external party, I think we probably underestimated a little bit how long it would take us to wade through some of that, but we did, and we just took a little bit more time than we had anticipated to do that. So there's a real learning there from our perspective. And then also, as a result of that, and then some other questions as we went through this, Promising Outcomes developed a really helpful frequently asked questions list alongside a project handbook, which were essential tools. And with the benefit of hindsight, which we didn't have, we would have perhaps thought about developing some of those up front. Then again, they only came from the questions that were asked. So if we'd had that, we would have shared that up front. So a couple of learnings for us to take away. And if we run this sort of lab again, those would be in place. So there was a bit of patience required at the beginning for setting it up. So that's just what I wanted to share with you really, was how did the lab actually run, and over what period, and how really thank the members that took part for making it as smooth as it was.
Okay, thank you very much, Helena. And again, colleagues, this transparency we were really sort of keen in, because it's not normal to sort of do some of these things this way. And say we did come across some bumps in the road, say particularly getting the contractual and actually finding the good quality data as well. So there's lots of sort of learning that, and we just want to sort of be honest with you around that. We're getting lots of questions coming through in the chat. I'm hoping that our next speaker, Bill Fullen from Believe, will be able to answer some of them, because a number of them are around, well, so what have you done now with these things? So Bill, you're CEO of Believe. You've really got sort of behind this as part of a wider sort of strategy for changing the operating model. Do you want to sort of, again, take 10 minutes and sort of take us through your experiences as a leader within the business, and how you are using and what you thought of the findings?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I've got a few slides to share, if that's okay. So I guess you're going to have to.
Yeah, I'll make you a. 1 second. I'll make you a co-host. Yeah. There you go. You should be able to share, Bill. Yeah, we can see them.
Yeah. So yeah, as Ian said, good afternoon, everybody. I'm from Believe Housing. We're a LSVT organisation based primarily in County Durham. We manage 18,500 properties. So got a few slides just to say why we got involved and why we thought the DINLab was a really useful way to test some things out, some of the lessons we've learned, and what we're doing with the findings moving forward. And for me, there was 3 areas that I think had been kind of nagging in the back of my mind about, do these things really help us in terms of taking our services forward? Limitations of satisfaction surveys, some of the white paper comments around the satisfaction measures that they propose to introduce, and then finally the change in expectations of our customers, primarily around the coronavirus period, and how that has perhaps changed the expectations of customers. And like every other housing organisation, we do a whole range of satisfaction surveys, annual star surveys, transactional surveys, COVID sentiment surveys during various lockdowns. So we do an awful lot, and they have their place. But I think, for me, the DINLab give us the opportunity to test out whether there was another way of engaging with customers to make sure that we responded to their expectations. And for me, a fundamental question is that we still use a very old-fashioned, low-tech measurement of satisfaction, when a lot of other sectors we know are moving away from that and more towards identifying customers' expectations. And I don't think satisfaction surveys necessarily tell us an awful lot about expectations. They give us a snapshot of what people felt about a particular service in a transactional way. And do they fool us to think we're better than we actually are? And what was interesting in the DINLab and those scores around the zone of tolerance was that when we do our annual star survey, our scores are always relatively high around customer satisfaction. So we pat ourselves on the back and think, yeah, we're doing a great job. I think one of the eye openers around the zone of tolerance was, well, actually, we might not be doing that great in terms of how we measure against people's expectations of the ideal organization. And again, one of the other focuses I wanted to look at is kind of when we do the star survey, we immediately identify those areas that don't perform as well, and then think about an action plan to improve that performance. But it might be investing in the wrong area. And I think the work that Promise and Outcomes did show us that those that score the lowest might not necessarily be the best things to invest resources into. And then the white paper, for me, you know, I'm an old lag. I've been doing housing for about 40 odd years. And for me, those tenant satisfaction measures in the white paper, those proposed ones, I know they're being developed, were pretty traditional. And for me, didn't talk an awful lot about taking organizations forward and resolving or addressing people's expectations. So I think for us as an organization, yes, like everyone else, we will obviously calculate and do satisfaction surveys, but I think we need to go beyond that if we're going to take organizations forward, because I think customers have increased and changing expectations. And a lot of that will have been born out of their experience over the last 18 months or so, where a number of our customers have got into home shopping and home deliveries, much more two-way dialogue with the service providers. And sometimes we think that housing services operate in a bubble and our customers aren't influenced by what goes on in the outside world. So I think coronavirus has burst that bubble, and we need to think about, are we sure that the expectations of our customers are being met? So for me, why we got involved in the DINLab was about all of those three areas coming together, but also to test drive that new approach. And the beauty of the DINLabs was it's a low cost, low risk learning process, collaborating with other like-minded organizations in the sector, and fundamentally to see if that approach was right for us. And on the initial workshop, this concept of the zone of tolerance and the tenant experience gap index were really interesting concepts that I just wanted to see, is that a better way of focusing our resources based on those results? And the lab finally gave us the opportunity to understand how expectations have developed and how this complements some of our existing activities. So for me, getting involved was a no-brainer. And I guess the results that Rob went through showed that it was a fairly low response rate, but notwithstanding that, I think there were some lessons learned. And for me, it highlighted the importance of getting some of those basics right about customer service. And if we were looking for a silver bullet, that there would be one area that we could focus our investment in order to improve people's satisfaction and meet their expectations, it wasn't there. I think that zone of tolerance was fairly narrow for the whole range of elements, and so that we need to focus in across the whole of those to make sure that we can address some of those concerns. And I think some of the key areas for me were around two-way communication, people keep customers involved in progress, and responding to how we improving how we respond to customers. One of the big surprises for me was that the updating the property was a much bigger issue for our customers than we'd been led to believe through the traditional surveys. So again, that's for us as an area that we need to possibly focus in on future. So, although the lab, for us, we limited numbers of our customers who responded, but it does allow us to look at more detailed findings for our customers. And what we are doing is using that information as part of that overall review about how do we improve our service offer, reflecting on what tenants have told us about their expectations and how they interact with us, and how our processes sometimes fall down and impact negatively on the customer. So what we propose to do is to review the work we did with the lab alongside the STAR survey that should be going out soon, and any other internal information, to understand what actions we can take. And that we look at how do we embed some of those techniques in our engagement activities, so that we can come to a better understanding of what our customer expectations are. And I think that, for me, is it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. A great sort of run through there. And I hope that's answered sort of Linda Higgs' session in terms of what you're sort of going to do with the results. But if I can sort of just bring Rowan and Helena back on the screen with your mics on as well. And if John Davidson and Paul Harris can get their mics sort of ready, I will be coming to you. But there's a few questions I thought it would be worth just to get some quick answers on. Justin Crittall from Vivid asked, how representative were the respondents against the sort of the customer profile? So I suppose this is a data question in terms of, how reliable was this? Rowan, do you want to sort of
yeah,
of
course, and Kathy can join in with this. I need to stress the point that this is a taster. This is, as you said, Ian, this is a test before you invest, and therefore we're doing a fairly small size of sample. It's not the whole tenant audience. It's not a multiple customer segmented study. It's only a small tester. And in the normal circumstances, when we do this for an organization, we are of course looking at the entire audience. So this is a reduced, if you like, version of what we do normally. Kathy, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's also worthy noting that, because we do a two-stage set of research, we do expectations gathering first and then do performance against those expectations. Excuse me. The initial expectations gathering is a qualitative exercise. So you don't have to have all total respondents for that. You just need a sufficient number to be a reasonable sample size from each of your different segments if you were going to do this inside your own organization, so that you've got enough qualitative data to spot the trends and bring to life what's probably going on for many in terms of what their expectations are.
Thank you.
We also actually did general needs. We made an agreement between us to just do general needs rather than go for the tenure types. So that was a decision we made as a group, really, because we wanted to be inclusive of everybody.
Yeah, and that was mainly also because 5 organisations were being involved in this. We wanted a level of commonality.
Yeah.
Rather than confuse the data with different people coming at it from slightly different angles. It wouldn't have made a clear set of data for the lab.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. A question from
John asked. Sorry, Ian, John asked a second question, which was how often should the surveys be repeated? Generally speaking, it depends on how quickly an organization can respond to the data, but normally the answer is roughly around about a year, plus or minus 3 months. If you do it too often, you won't have had a chance to implement the sort of the improvements that the customers are looking for, and you stand into the risk of annoying them. So that's a second question.
Tom Pepper asked a good question about, did tenants get confused by the questions or the methodology because it's a different approach? Did we find anything around that at all?
No.
No. Good answer.
In fact, but there were a couple of occasions where people had device problems from their own. They couldn't get at it from whatever device they were using because they had something wrong with their phone, and they were so desperate to participate because they could see it, but their phone wouldn't let them play. So they kept ringing us up and saying, "Can you find a way to fix my phone so I can play?"
Brilliant.
So no, actually, we didn't get any questions at all about what am I answering and why is it different. And because one of the reasons we when we actually go out with the survey, we make it very clear and very simple what they need to do with regards to filling out the survey, not a problem.
Okay, then, right. I'm going to bring Paul Harris, then John Davidson, and if Tracy Price can also get ready as well, I'd love to bring you up on stage as well. So Paul Harris from Cura, do you want to switch your mic on? Camera is optional, and ask your question.
Thanks, Ian. I really like this piece of research. It's really interesting. I'm just struggling to work out where it sits, because I've got that same list of issues that customers tell me are important. I can get that list through existing tech surveys. I can get it through focus groups. It's the same list, more or less, that I will get from another route. And in this sector, we seem to spend a lot of time confusing ourselves about the difference between perception and transactional service satisfaction. And we use the word satisfaction for both of them. So Bill was talking about the STAR survey. That is a perception measure that has a high level target on there, which is all about satisfaction, overall service quality. And yet we probably all measure our repairs, service satisfaction, and we talk about satisfaction in slightly different ways. And you started off, Rowan, by saying, yeah, satisfaction is no good. We're doing expectations. It's much better. I'll tell you why later. I'd love to know what the science is behind that, and also whether this means that we don't have to bother with either, or it sits in the middle of the two, or what does it mean?
Okay, let's deal with that one. Thank you, Paul. It's been known for well over 20 years that customer satisfaction is not a reliable predictor of customer behavior or loyalty. In the 1990s, there was Harvard Business Review's articles published on this. And the background to this is quite simple. Customer satisfaction is an emotional response to a perceived gap. As you said, it's perceptions. Emotions can be transitory, they can be temporary, they can be neutral, they can be strong, they can be weak. Expectations dispenses with emotion. It directly measures the respondent's perception of an experience, and it is thus therefore much more stable. Secondly, some respondents in satisfaction surveys will select satisfied when they mean it is merely okay, or they simply don't care. And there's a lot of evidence to show that. Expectations measurement is not subject to these situations and therefore is inherently more predictive. In contemporary customer satisfaction surveys, expectations are actually ignored because they're not measuring expectations, they're measuring satisfaction. And respondents are asked about their satisfaction alone. Questions are usually provided either by the management team of the organization wishing to have the data, or by third-party providers, or by using standard questionnaires. And get back to your point, Paul, about what matters to customers. We very, very rarely see questionnaires being put out where the questions are designed by the customer, or the person who has to complete the survey. Surveys based on expectations voiced by the actual customers are bespoke, and they are working, if you like, for every client at every level. And that's one of the things that it makes a big difference to them. But the result of this is that we tend to get quite high response rates because the questions resonate with the customer because they created them in the first place. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I mean, there's a lot there, but yeah, that's very helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, John, John Davidson, do you want to ask your question as well?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. It was really around the expectations, so a bit of a follow-on, I suppose. That was there similarity between the different organisations and the expectation scores? So effectively, did all customers have similar expectations? And if the answer is yes, and it sounds like it is, then it feels like the sector should know what expectations are, and it's only how each individual organisation is performing against each of those. So you kind of almost set an industry standard that applies across all different providers.
It won't surprise you to know that industry across a single industry, expectations will be quite similar. But comparing housing associations to, let's say, private banking, to use an extreme, is not that the expectations will be very different. So that's the point. That's one of the key things. Across a specific industry, they will be quite similar.
There's an extra point to this as well. Broad brush strokes. If we were to expand the study across a much wider audience, that would either confirm nor deny the similarities of expectations, right? Yeah. So as a very, very large bucket with all the expectations thrown in, they're likely to be very similar because people are receiving a similar service. So it wouldn't be surprising if they're similar. However, the weighting of them might be different per organization. because your tenants might be living in a different environment, or a different part of the world, or they might have something different with their local councils. It might actually change the order of the ranking of the rating of the expectations. So they might have more emphasis on one than the other. And similarly, when it comes to doing the performance survey, you'll often find that the same data, if you like, cut by maybe segment or region or company or whatever, again, they might have a different zone of tolerance. It might be shorter, longer, higher up the scale, lower down the scale. And obviously your performance, therefore, for each company would be different.
And if I can add to that, when one does repeat surveys on an annual basis or similar, one of the interesting characteristics, it isn't that the expectation that tends to change too much. What does change is the zone of tolerance. Now, one other interesting aspect about this, which is purely to do with the pandemic, we have noticed in the data that we collect and in the sort of research that we do, that one of the things that organizations tend to focus on very much is customer needs, which are necessary, but they aren't sufficient. And if I just give you an analogy, my wife ordered some groceries off a supermarket website. We never got them because we couldn't get a slot for delivery and we couldn't get into the call center. So we went to a competitor. In that story, what has happened is that our needs for food have not changed. What has happened is our expectations of how the food gets to us have changed dramatically. And Ian touched on this at the beginning. And this is a really important aspect about the nature of the, if you like, the forced changes that the pandemic has driven to organizations in the respect that they need to think much more differently about how they interact with their customers.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rowan. I mean, just to sort of back that up, every DIN member I've spoken to recently has said the same thing. Customer demand and customer expectations are going through the roof, way beyond sort of what it was in lockdown one. And secondly, their sort of, I suppose, level of tolerance has also sort of decreased as well. So something's definitely sort of happening around there as well. So I'm going to ask, I've got two more questions, and I'm going to bring the rest of the panel in. So Tracy Price, you want to switch your mic on and ask your question?
I do. Oh, I've got a chest infection, so I'll try my best. So I think my question was around the kind of confidence levels and errors of margin. So that's something I've always kind of done when I do surveys, just to make sure that the recommendations that are being delivered are kind of representative of the kind of whole sample. But I think that question was kind of almost answered a little bit earlier. Yeah. And I think one of the things that we're doing at Live, is we've got our annual survey to do, and we want to try and do it in a different way. So going back to, I think somebody else mentioned earlier, that we can't just go off the white paper, it's not enough. We really need to understand what our customers' wants and needs are from us as a housing provider. Yeah. So that's something that we're looking to address. And it's, I suppose my job is to look at how do we get all of that without kind of that survey exhaustion as well. So what are the different kind of means that we've got available? So yeah, I think you answered the question earlier around the kind of qualitative bit.
Yeah, for the lab, because we were doing it on a restricted audience, then obviously we weren't going to go into confidence levels or any factor analysis or advanced analysis, to do any correlations or anything like that. That's all technical jargon. So it wasn't necessary for the purposes of this restricted thing. But if you're going to do it on a scale, then it would be a good thing to be able to do some of that driver analysis and some of the correlations, just to double check.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Final question for this point is from Tom Lansfield. How much, in your experience, do you think expectations will change over time? And I want to ask this one because some people might be sat there thinking, as the results that you shared, that they'll be going, so what? Yeah, we knew repairs would be sort of top of the list kind of thing. But I think it's more about actually they are less forgiving. That stuff they just expect. That's what you must do. These other areas we're going to be a bit more forgiving on. So in your experience, Kathy, Rowan, do people change their expectations a lot of the time?
I'll start and then Kathy can go on. Yes is the answer. And interesting enough, before the pandemic, we used to say that expectations change slowly over a sort of 3-year period, roughly, depending on industry. We're now changing that in the light of the data because they're beginning to change much more rapidly. And I think there's a couple of things that are setting this change in place. And I think Bill touched on it, and I think there's a couple of things here which are very, very relevant. And that is customers are experiencing changes in the way they interact with providers, very much driven today by technology. Let me give you a specific example. If you are now having a delivery done of a product of some sort that you bought online to your home, the benchmark is Amazon. And therefore you expect that whoever it is, the provider, is actually going to do the same level or the same performance level as Amazon. And so, you know, the movers and shakers in any particular industry are setting the standard, and that's where the expectations are changing. Now, take this one step further forward. Pandemics are historically places where change happens very rapidly indeed. And indeed, after pandemics, there is even more change. You know, after the 1920 pandemic, there was a 5 to 10 year period of very rapid change. And I think we can see that this is going to be a very common characteristic, that expectations will change very rapidly. The other factor which is affecting this is that more and more customers are getting more and more aware of what technology can do for them personally, obviously through the use of smartphones and the like, and the use of apps and so forth. We can get it more simpler, faster, better. Gartner, the organization that does a lot of research in this field, reckon that we're going to have more change due to technology in the next 5 years than we've had in the last 50. So I think, summarizing what you're saying, expectations will be changing, and they will be changing faster. The challenge, of course, is to keep up.
Great way to finish. Yeah. Cathy, I'm just going to sort of bring Andrew Van Dorn from Hacked-In and Alla O'Halloran from TPAS in as well, because again, I thought it would be really helpful if we could get a couple of sort of thought leaders' views who are perhaps looking at this through sort of different lenses. And what I thought I'd sort of do is sort of start off by asking each of them who've had sort of a pre-sight of what the findings were, but also what they've sort of heard today, I suppose, to give their perspective on the findings of the lab. And then we'll go into a sort of a wider discussion about what happens next. So, Drew, could I perhaps ask you yourself to sort of come on and sort of, you know, share your view from Hacked?
Yeah, thank you so much, and for inviting me, and also for doing this piece of work. I think it's really, really interesting, and I'm a big fan of anything that can break the 30-year collusion that's been going on in the social housing sector around customer satisfaction measures, because it feels like we have been colluding on this issue since they were introduced by the then Housing Corporation in 1989. And so I'm a real fan of this piece of work, and I'm actually a fan of how we bring together a whole range of insight on how we deliver our services, how those services are received, the quality of those services and what's perceived about that, and the expectations of the people who live in the homes that we manage. And I think for me, it's about having a range of different kind of areas of insight. If we over rely on any one measure, we're always at risk of missing things and missing other aspects. But I think the thing that I often reflect on in this space, and it's work that, and this really chimes with the work that we've done looking at the whole question of kind of rethinking customer insight, is that often we spend a lot of time talking about how do we generate insight. We probably spend a little less time thinking about how we're going to actually improve, then delivering that improvement, and then feeding that back, and then being prepared for more feedback and more improvement. So it becomes a kind of a continuous improvement cycle where we're actually thinking and talking about excellence and quality in our services and in our organizations in a way which is live, it's dynamic, it's improving, and we can kind of use then insight and data to be able to demonstrate that we are changing, but also that change is being received and how that change is being received. And I think that's where we've got to get to with this, because I think too often that feedback loop gets broken. And the work that we've done in the past tells us time and time again that unless we actually do something with this type of insight, then actually there's no value that's being driven as a result of it. I think the few things that I reflect on from having had an early look at this with Rowan a couple of days ago was that I was really interested in this kind of question around that zone of tolerance, and also where do we sit in that zone of tolerance, and how do we actually change that zone of tolerance. And I think the question was asked about changing expectations. Actually, I think changing expectations should be viewed as part of improvement. If people are, I think it would be fair to say that many people who live in social housing probably have a low expectation of their landlord. And we hear that all the time in all of the consultation that goes on. And actually over years, what we've done is we've created an environment where actually they probably don't expect enough of us. And, so just to hear that we've got, coming out of a pandemic, that actually expectations are changing by external factors. I think that we've also got to try and create change from an internal perspective as well, and that we can, and that actually people who live in social homes should be expecting more of us, and actually we should be delivering more for them too. And therefore, I'd be really interested to see how do those zones change? Do they move up? Do they narrow as well? And over time, actually, when we're sitting there in that kind of 1 to 7 scale, can we move it up further and further? So actually, that whole change in the expectations isn't just something that we are impacted by, it's something that we're seeking to drive, and that becomes part of our continuous improvement. And then I think the other thing that I'd reflect on is we're a sector that loves to benchmark, but we're also a sector that doesn't necessarily use benchmarking information in a particularly useful way. We don't generate enough insight through it. And I'd be interested to know that, are there any of those kind of expectation measures that can be reflected in other sectors and industries? So the kind of respond in a timely manner, or be tenant focused, or be customer focused. Do we see similar types of expectations in other industries, and could we begin to kind of benchmark against those? Because I think too often I feel that when one of the other bits of collusion that we've done in our sectors, that we kind of all want to be in that upper quartile, but if that upper quartile is mediocrity and not massively responsive, then actually we're colluding to be just good enough, or maybe slightly worse than just good enough. And I think I'd like to start to look at, how can we be excellent? How can we drive that excellence? How can we drive that quality? How does it become part of our DNA in our sector, given that I very rarely hear people talk in those terms when they think about the improvement journeys that they're on?
And straight away, I'd love to say, this is wonderful, Drew. It's also hugely ambitious, as you recognise yourself. I think there's a couple of things that's worth saying here. Organisations who have got the sort of feedback loop that you're describing in place and actually working on it is actually relatively few. And the reason for that is because many try, but very few succeed. It has to have a certain attitude and approach and style inside the management and leadership of those organizations to make it work. The number of companies that have been doing this effectively in the commercial environment over 50, 60 years is very few. Having said that, those ones that are in that category, that are bringing that continuous improvement feedback loop into place, are of course ones we all know about. They're famous because they're successful. And if I just give you one example, in the motor industry, Toyota is famous for this. They have a production system which is embedded in every part of the organization, but it is hugely cultural, massively cultural. And you hear Toyota people who've left the company and find themselves trying to work in other organizations and can't work at all because it's just so different. I think the second thing, benchmarking, the point you made there, yes, we can see benchmarking examples across industries, but I would be cautious of trying to use it in too much detail. So respond in a timely manner would absolutely be an expectation we would see in quite a lot of industries. It's very, very common. But the key word there is timely. What does timely mean to the individual customers? And timely in one industry means a very different thing from timely in another. It could be seconds in one and days in another. And so one has to be able to look into the detail a little bit more to be able to understand that. And I think the other thing that is very much front and mind of our thinking is we let the customer do the talking. We let the data tell a story. And once we've got that data, then we actually look at it in detail. Last word for you on this point, benchmarking can be dangerous. And I'm very much aware of organizations who talk about benchmarking, but all they're doing is actually making a comparison. It's not benchmarking. And if I just use an example from banking, they say they want their scores to be similar to another bank. And I say questions like, well, you're taking a survey done at a different time with a different group of customers in different circumstances. What is there to compare? And so that this is important, really important. If you're going to do comparisons, they've got to be accurate comparisons.
Thanks very much, Rowan. I mean, to sort of add to that, I mean, people say it's comparing apples with apples. There are 7,000 different varieties of apples, if you didn't already know that. And the Toyota one's a brilliant example. We did a visit there, and what was really interesting, what stuck with my mind, when they have board meetings, the board spend an hour going through the business, the running the business, to spend the rest of the day on the shop floor asking the workers, what problems have you solved since we were last here? Anna O'Halloran from TPAS. Now, obviously, you're working very, very closely with tenants and residents. So I'd be very interested, a bit like Drew, sort of in your sort of summary and sort of challenge to us about this area.
Thanks, Ian. Well, I don't know if any of you could see me while Drew was talking, but I feel I was so vigorously nodding my head that my head was going to fall off and roll across the floor. Like Drew, I'm so pleased to see something that's different to satisfaction measures. And I suppose, like Drew, what I'm interested in is anything that will make the sector sit up and listen. It's another source of evidence, isn't it? To tell us stuff that we already know, but if it's stuff that we need to hear again from a different source, and it's that drives the behaviour change within our organisations, then that's what we need to do. It's a constant surprise to me how organisations continually say, oh, that's not a surprise to us. And I think, well, if it's not a surprise to you, why haven't you dealt with it? So I'm being a bit flippant there, but I did love the methodology, and along with Drew the other day, I had an early glimpse at it. And I love anything that involves an analysis of qualitative insight. I love anything that targets customers for their insight and their experience, rather than simply seeking out the opinions of volunteers. Who will often be people who've simply got enough time to give us some feedback, rather than people who've necessarily got the experience that we need to hear about. The work that you've done in the project does echo some of the stuff that we've been doing, you might be surprised to hear, over the last 18 months or so, thinking about what is the real currency of an organisation. And I think we've talked, as Drew says, for 30 years about satisfaction, and I suppose I was guilty of driving that in with a heavy hammer when I was a housing inspector. So apologies for that. I've realised now that there are other measures. And something that we've been looking at in the work we've been doing at TPAS is to think, could we think about trust as the currency of an organisation? Is the nature of the relationship between landlord and tenant as measured by trust an interesting concept to unravel a bit more in terms of determining the quality of the relationship, what people then do? If you are a trustworthy organisation, does that mean your tenants will act in a particular way? If you trust your tenants, does it mean you should act in a particular way in order to demonstrate that? And that's elicited some of the same information that's come out today, albeit in a different format, in terms of that zone of tolerance and level of expectation. I absolutely love all of that. I think the points you've been making around low expectations that many of you have made are absolutely spot on. And the trouble is, we get sucked into that, don't we? That sort of yes, we're brilliant, but we're measured against organisations that perhaps are mediocre. Not quite a race to the bottom, but we do need to be better. We do need to push people's expectations up. And we need to narrow that zone of tolerance. Customers that we work with are very, very tolerant of their landlord's behaviour. Some of the instances that we hear about would make your hair curl. Organisations whose culture seems to be that they can routinely hang up on customers, they can laugh at them, they can critique their lifestyles, they can make those customers feel ashamed. And so that's horrifying, isn't it? When I think as a sector we position ourselves as delivering an ethical service, and yet the experience of customers, which informs their expectations, is that we're far from ethical. But that cognitive dissonance is too difficult to handle, isn't it? We like to continue to tell ourselves the story that we're behaving ethically, that we are putting the customer at the heart of what we do. So absolutely fascinated by this research. I'd like to see where it goes in terms of, so now what? And of course, inevitably, as an ex-inspector, I suppose I would say that. But I'm interested to unpick really, what does it mean in terms of, can you infer a way a customer might behave as a result of where they might feature in terms of, are their expectations being met? How narrow is their zone of tolerance? What might they then do as a result of that? So thinking about the behavioural feedback loop, I suppose, that's an interesting thing that we've started to work on. I just wonder if this research helps inform that too. I think the other thing to think about is it seemed to me in the methodology that through this kind of targeted approach of approaching some customers to fill in the survey was an opportunity to pick up those silent voices that obviously are mentioned in the latest Ombudsman Spotlight report, but something that we've been talking about for a long time. You can't just listen to the people who step forward. You've got to seek out other experiences. So I think you can tell I absolutely loved it. Deeply envious not to have been involved earlier on. Ian, I'm looking at you. I think it's fascinating. I hope that it is another way of measuring how well we're doing as a sector, and more power to your elbow, really. But thanks for inviting me to say something.
No, that's really helpful, Anna. I think there's a few things from me. I mean, now that sort of ITV News are the new regulator for the sector, I think we are going to have to sort of change and up our ante for what we're actually doing. And as Paul Harris said in his question, actually, you probably need a portfolio of different ways to sort of, to get us to that next sort of stage around this. And particularly, I think what I liked about it was it picks up weak signals. And we're not necessarily, we tend to deal in sort of absolutes, and actually housing is there's lots of weak signals out there. And I know there's lots of other organizations are much better than housing at picking up those weak signals and solving the issues before they sort of come live. I've had a really good question from Ashley. Ashley Humphreys has posted one there. I don't know whether you can sort of see it, but he's got a question about, customers in social housing don't have choice. And so he's not convinced about comparing with other sectors and other organizations, particularly retail, where there is a choice. Is that relevant? I just wondered, obviously, Kathy, Rowan, you work in lots of sort of other sectors around that.
Yeah.
How would you answer that?
Yeah, it's actually quite
Lovely question.
Yeah, it's a lovely question. We do get asked it quite a lot, and it's interesting that the point is made, Ashley's made, which is absolutely correct. That there isn't a choice, there isn't a switching ability as you would have in a commercial environment. I think there are some things though, which one needs to understand at very much a micro level. If a customer of a housing association wants to have some repairs done, and they get in touch with the right person, then their expectations of what the speed of response will be doesn't come from housing associations, it comes from other areas. And that's what we're really talking about. So expectations do transfer across different sectors. And I was talking to somebody this morning, and having flown on Virgin Airways, I expected Virgin Trains to be similar to Virgin Airways. Well, I was deeply disappointed. They're the same brand, they're the same name, but the fact is, an expectation traveling from one part of a brand to another part of a brand is what people do expect. It is also very relevant that the fact that we do take these expectations across from different areas has an overall impact. So we're looking at what we're doing here is looking at in the round, but you need to look expectation by expectation to get an accurate fix on some of the things that are coming out here, because they are very specific to individual people. Kathy, do you want to?
Yeah, there's also, I mean, to your point, Ashley, about people being effectively, captive audience, they're not going to go anywhere else. It's absolutely crucial to sort of just think about the fact that they might not have the ability to go somewhere else, but whilst they're sat on your books, they can make your life a living hell. So if they're picking up the phone to your call center 5 times instead of 1, because the first time it was dealt with properly, then they've just saved you 4 extra calls and time of your organization and frustration inside. So they might not be able to walk, but they can engage with you in ways that save you time, energy, frustration, and themselves time, energy, and frustration. So it works its way through from a different angle. And to something that Andrew said earlier on about, and Anna as well, about pushing expectations further up. your customers' expectations will be your customers' expectations, and the levels that they expect, their ideal levels that they expect, will be coming at them from lots of different inputs that they get in their general life. So rather than getting too worried about trying to push expectations further up that scale, rest in the knowledge that, you know, for example, when we do our research, we start from the point of ideal, and then we allow the people to actually score according to their reality. And so you don't have to think about pushing their expectations further up the scale. They will do that for you.
Yeah.
And the gift, there was another brilliant comment on there I saw about don't collect data to tell you how good you are, but tell you how to improve. Yeah. Absolutely brilliant, because one of the things that we make sure that we do when we do the performance survey is it's all very well giving us a gap, you know, a score against the expectations, but the follow-up question, and it's a qualitative one, what would it take, you know, what are your suggestions for improvement to bridge that gap? So the customer is amazingly, you know, generous in the fact that they gift you the way to bridge that gap. Okay. So you have clarity about what their ideal is, you have clarity about how well you're performing against that, and they gift you the route map to get there. What's not to love?
Right, okay, finishing on a high there, Kathy. We was asked the question, you know, so what comes next? There's two things I'll finish with before I wrap up the session. Obviously, this was a relatively small scale experiment, and we've learned a huge amount, and hopefully we've shared with you some of the potential of looking at things through a different way. What we'd like to sort of do in 2022 is to have a deeper, longer dive into the methodology, so we can start to address some of the questions that everybody posted on the chat about, you know, representative samples and things like that. So we will send out the recording, but if there are organizations who'd be interested in being part of that, it's not another experiment, it will be a full run through. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to see what happens next as a result of this, because we don't have all of the answers with this. So again, if you can get in touch with Helena about that, we can share what we'd like to do there. And then the second thing is, as I say, one of the things that always winds me up about the sector has been, you know, duplication of effort. I promise you, from DIN's perspective, this is something we want to do in collaboration with both HACT, with Drew, and with Anna at TPAS, because ultimately, if this is a better way, then we want as many people as possible to be participating within this. Now, obviously, you know, it hasn't got any regulatory sort of compliance yet because they're still in consultation around that. But hopefully, if people have found this a useful exercise, we can use this to have that conversation and perhaps sort of influence that as well. So there's further discussions on the way. Thank you so much for your contributions today. Thanks to everybody who's participated within the lab, and for Helena and for Bill and for Rowan and Kathy for sharing their insights today, and for Drew and for Anna as well, who gave us some very, very interesting insights there as well, and for all yourself, for all the things you've posted on chat. It's to say it's been a really big webinar, so clearly this is an area of interest, and hopefully we can come back to this in the future. But could you just switch your mics on and just give all of our panelists and speakers just a nice round of applause, as if we're in the room with them. Thanks, guys, and we'll send the recording out.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks very much.